At 6:42 on a Saturday morning, I opened my garage door and found my dead wife's boat gone. For 3 years after Clara's funeral, that 1961 wooden runabout had sat exactly where she left it. The tools were still on the wall. The cedar dust was still on the floor. The promise I made to her was still in that room, but the boat was not. Then my son walked up the driveway, holding a white paper receipt and a large iced coffee. "I sold it," Brandon said, just like that, like he was talking about an old lawnmower. I turned around slowly. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to set my coffee mug down on the workbench before I dropped it. "You sold what?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "The boat, Dad," he said, rolling his eyes. "Monica wanted to go to Paris for our anniversary. We needed the cash. It was just sitting here taking up space." That was the moment something inside me quietly snapped. I looked at the boy Clara had patiently packed school lunches for every morning for 12 years. I looked at the man who had just sold the last dream his mother left unfinished to fund a European vacation. "Mom's gone." "Dad," Brandon continued, his voice taking on a tone of arrogant, manufactured pity. "The boat wasn't bringing her back." I did not hit him. I did not scream. I just walked to the empty space on the garage floor, knelt down on the cold concrete, and picked up one tiny dried curl of old varnish that Clara had missed when she swept up 3 years ago. Clara had spent 25 years restoring that boat one plank at a time. My son sold it in one phone call. And what Brandon did not know was that the boat he sold was not empty. Before my wife died, she had hidden something inside the hull. Something she had built for the exact day our son forgot what her memory was worth. The story of the boat did not begin with an argument. It began with a rescue. When Brandon was 11 years old, Clara and I were driving through a rural stretch of county highway when she suddenly slammed on the brakes. She pulled our station wagon onto the gravel shoulder and pointed at a dilapidated, collapsing barn. Leaning against the side of the barn, half buried in tall weeds and covered in a rotting blue tarp, was a wooden hull. It was a 1961 Chris Craft runabout. The wood was gray, splintered, and rotting from years of neglect. The brass fittings were completely oxidized. The engine was a rusted block of useless metal. To anyone else, it was firewood. To Clara, it was a challenge. She found the owner, an elderly farmer who just wanted it off his property, and bought the hull for $300. We hitched it to the bumper and dragged it home. That boat became the third member of our marriage. Clara named it the Clara Mae after her grandmother. She didn't buy a restoration kit or hire a professional shop to do the work. She went to the library, checked out books on marine carpentry, and taught herself how to steam and bend mahogany planks. During the early years, the garage was a place of magic. Brandon used to sit in the driveway for hours, watching his mother work. Clara would let him hold the flashlight, or let him hand her the brass screws. She would tell him stories about the lakes she had visited when she was a little girl, and how one day they were all going to glide across the water in a boat built entirely by their own hands. But as Brandon grew older, the magic faded. By the time he was 16, he stopped coming into the garage. He complained about the smell of the marine varnish clinging to Clara's clothes. He was embarrassed that his parents spent their weekends covered in sawdust instead of going to country clubs or driving luxury cars like the parents of his high school friends. "Why are you wasting your time with that piece of junk?" Brandon had asked her one evening, standing in the doorway of the garage, refusing to step inside and get dust on his new sneakers. "You could just buy a fiberglass boat. They're faster anyway." Clara had stopped sanding. She looked at her teenage son, wiping her hands on her denim apron. "Because buying something new doesn't mean you appreciate it, Brandon," she had told him gently. "It just means you have money. Fixing something that's broken, that takes love. I want this boat to mean something." Brandon had just rolled his eyes and walked back into the house. He never understood it. He never understood that Clara wasn't just building a boat. She was building a legacy. She was building a physical manifestation of patience, care, and endurance. And then the cancer came. It was aggressive, merciless, and terrifyingly fast. Within 6 months of the diagnosis, Clara was too weak to stand in the garage. She lost her hair. She lost her strength. But she never lost her fierce, protective love for the life we had built together. During her final weeks, we set up a hospital bed in the living room. From her pillows, she could look through the large picture window and see the driveway and the open garage door where the nearly finished wooden hull of the Clara Mae sat waiting. One afternoon, when Brandon was at work and the house was perfectly quiet, she asked me to sit beside her. Her hands were terrifyingly thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong when she took my hand. "Thomas," she had whispered, her breathing shallow and raspy. "I'm right here, Clara," I said, leaning close. "I'm not going to finish the boat," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet, heartbreaking acceptance of reality. I tried to tell her she was wrong, but she placed a finger over my lips. "Listen to me," she insisted. "I know I'm not going to finish her, but I need you to promise me something, anything. If I don't finish her, Thomas, promise me you won't let anyone treat her like junk. Promise me you won't let her be forgotten in a storage unit or chopped up for scrap. I put 25 years of my soul into that wood." "I promise, Clara," I said, the tears finally breaking and running down my face. "I promise I'll protect her." She had smiled, closed her eyes, and squeezed my hand. "Every good boat needs one secret compartment, Thomas," she had whispered, her mind beginning to drift with the pain medication. "That's where you keep the things storms shouldn't reach." She died 3 days later. I kept my promise. I kept the boat in the garage, perfectly preserved, a wooden monument to the woman I loved. I paid the registration fees. I maintained the trailer tires. I kept the dust off the hull. I protected it from everything. Everything except the devastating, casual greed of my own son. Brandon didn't just sell a piece of property. He didn't just clear out some garage space. He took my promise to my dying wife and traded it for a pair of plane tickets to Paris because his wife wanted to post photos in front of the Eiffel Tower. As I knelt on the cold concrete of the garage, holding the tiny curl of varnish, I realized that I didn't just lose a boat. I had lost my son, too. But I didn't know yet that Clara had anticipated this exact moment. I didn't know that my wife, even in her final, painful days, had understood the true nature of the boy she had raised far better than I ever did. And I didn't know that she had left a trap waiting for him inside the hull of the Clara Mae. The decision to sell my wife's legacy was not born out of a sudden, desperate financial emergency. It was born out of a quiet, calculated resentment that had been festering in my daughter-in-law for years. Monica did not understand the concept of sentimental value. To her, an object was only as valuable as the social currency it could buy. She was 34 years old, impeccably groomed, and obsessed with curating a lifestyle that looked perfect on the internet. When she looked at the heavy, hand-carved wooden dining table Clara and I had purchased on our honeymoon, she didn't see decades of family dinners. She saw a bulky antique that clashed with her minimalist aesthetic. And when she looked at the garage, she didn't see a monument to a dying woman's love. She saw a storage unit full of trash. I didn't hear the conversation that led to the sale, but I didn't need to. Months later, during the civil recovery process, Evelyn recovered the text messages Monica had sent him the night before the theft. Monica had not hinted at the sale. She had ordered it. Brandon had texted her that they needed to scale back the trip because his bonus fell through. Monica's response was cold and absolute. "I've already told my friends we're staying at the George V. I'm not canceling Paris." When Brandon said they didn't have the cash, she itemized the solution. "Your father is hoarding a boat he never uses. It's a wooden coffin with a motor. Call marinas, ask for cash, avoid online listings, and do it before he gets sentimental." Brandon had hesitated. He texted back, "I can't just sell Dad's boat. It was Mom's." Monica's final text delivered the psychological blow with surgical precision. Are you a husband, Brandon, or are you still a little boy asking Daddy for permission? It's family property. Your mother is dead. It's not stealing if it was going to be yours someday anyway. We need the money now. That was all it took. A few carefully chosen words from a woman who wanted a vacation, and my son decided that 25 years of his mother's life was an acceptable price to pay for a passport stamp. Brandon still had a spare key to my house from when Clara was sick. He knew my schedule. He knew I went to the local hardware store and the diner every Saturday morning from 6 to 8. He didn't list the boat online. That would have left a digital trail. Instead, he made a few phone calls to local marinas and collectors, looking for someone who would pay cash and ask minimal questions. He found a buyer willing to pay $5,000 for a fully restored, vintage wooden hull. When the buyer arrived with a trailer early that Saturday morning, Brandon had the garage door open. He stood there in his designer clothes, holding a forged bill of sale. He didn't tell the buyer that the boat belonged to his grieving father. He spun a lie, claiming that he had inherited it, that his father had passed away, and that he was just trying to clear out the estate. He took the cash. He watched the buyer hitches the Clara Mae to a truck and drive away. And then he waited in the driveway for me to come home, holding his iced coffee, ready to tell me to get over it. For 3 days after the garage was emptied, I existed in a state of numb, suffocating paralysis. I didn't call the police. The local deputy, Mark Harlan, was a good man, but what was I supposed to tell him? That my son stole a wooden boat out of my garage? It was a civil matter, a family dispute. The police couldn't fix a broken heart, and they couldn't undo the absolute betrayal I felt every time I looked at the empty space on the concrete floor. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just sat in my armchair in the living room, staring out the window at the driveway, listening to the agonizing silence of a house that had been stripped of its last remaining soul. I had failed Clara. I had promised her, as she lay dying in that very room, that I would protect her legacy, and I had let a 36-year-old boy trade it for a handful of cash. On Tuesday afternoon, it started to rain. It was a cold, driving rain that beat against the windows and turned the sky a bruised, heavy gray. I was sitting in the dark, watching the water pool on the driveway, when my cell phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer it. I assumed it was a telemarketer, or perhaps Monica calling to demand that I apologize to Brandon for making him feel guilty about the sale. But something made me pick it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from 3 days of silence. "Is this Thomas Whitmore?" a man's voice asked. The voice was deep, rough around the edges, but carefully polite. "Yes." "Who is this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of rain hitting a metal roof and the faint, rhythmic clinking of boat rigging in the background. "Sir, my name is Leonard Briggs," the man said slowly. "I own a marina over in Oak Creek. I bought a 1961 wooden runabout from a man named Brandon last Saturday. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. "You bought my wife's boat," I said, the anger finally beginning to burn through the numbness in my chest. "He had no right to sell it to you. That boat was not his." "I know," Leonard said quietly. His response caught me off guard. He didn't sound defensive. He didn't sound like a man trying to protect a cheap investment. He sounded deeply troubled. "What do you mean, you know?" I asked. "When your son sold me the hull, he gave me a bill of sale," Leonard explained. "He told me you had passed away and that he was clearing out the estate. The wood was beautiful. The varnish work was some of the best I've ever seen. I brought it back to my shop to start checking the seals." He paused again, taking a heavy breath. "Sir, I've been restoring boats for 40 years. When someone puts that much love into a piece of wood, you can feel it. I was inspecting the aft bench this morning, checking the brass fittings, and I noticed a slight misalignment in the floorboards. My heart stopped. every good boat needs one secret compartment, Thomas. I pulled the boards up, Leonard continued, his voice dropping lower. There was a hidden compartment built into the hull. What was inside? I asked, my voice trembling. A cedar box, Leonard said, wrapped in heavy oilcloth. I didn't open the box, Mr. Whitmore. That's not my business. But there was a brass plaque attached to the top of it. It had your name on it and a warning. I stood up from the armchair. The exhaustion of the last 3 days vanished, replaced by a sudden electric surge of adrenaline. Where are you? I asked. Oak Creek Marina, slip number 4, Leonard replied. Sir, whoever restored this boat loved it too much for me to ignore what I found. You need to come down here, now. I hung up the phone. I didn't bother grabbing an umbrella. I walked out into the driving rain, got into my truck, and started the engine. As I drove toward the marina, my mind raced. Clara had never told me what she put in the secret compartment. I had always assumed it was something sentimental. A letter, perhaps. Some old photographs. A keepsake meant to comfort me if I ever decided to take the boat out on the water without her. But Clara was not just a sentimental woman. She was a fiercely intelligent, fiercely protective mother who had spent her entire life watching her son grow into a man she did not entirely trust. She had seen Brandon roll his eyes at her work. She had heard the dismissive way he talked about the things we valued. She had known, long before the cancer took her, that the moment she was gone, Brandon would view her legacy not as a memory to be cherished, but as an asset to be liquidated. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the glass as I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Oak Creek Marina. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the outlines of the boats tied to the docks. I parked the truck and ran toward a large corrugated metal boat shed at the end of the pier. The heavy metal door was rolled up. Inside, illuminated by the harsh glare of industrial work lights, sat the Clara Mae. She looked exactly as she had in my garage. The mahogany hull gleamed with the 25 coats of varnish Clara had painstakingly applied. The brass fittings caught the light. The scent of old wood and marine sealant hung heavy in the damp air. Standing next to the hull was a man in his late 50s, wearing a faded canvas jacket and a baseball cap. Leonard Briggs. He didn't offer to shake my hand. He just nodded respectfully and stepped back, gesturing toward the back of the boat. I climbed up the small wooden stepladder and looked down into the hull. The wooden planks beneath the aft bench had been carefully removed, revealing a dark, dry cavity built seamlessly into the frame. Resting inside the cavity was a small box made of aromatic cedar. I reached down and lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. The wood was smooth, sanded with the same obsessive care Clara had given the rest of the boat. Attached to the lid was a small, polished brass plaque. I wiped the rainwater from my eyes and read the engraving. It wasn't a poem. It wasn't a gentle farewell. It was a direct, devastating command from a woman who knew exactly what her son was capable of. Asterisk Thomas, if this boat was sold, read everything before forgiving anyone. Acht. I stared at the 6 words, the blood freezing in my chest. Clara hadn't just left a memory. She had left a weapon. I stood inside the dimly lit boat shed, listening to the heavy rainhammer against the corrugated metal roof. My hands were shaking so badly that the small brass hinges of the cedar box rattled slightly as I held it. Leonard Briggs stepped back, giving me a respectful amount of space. He crossed his arms and stared at the floor, offering a quiet solidarity that my own son had never possessed. I set the box down on a small, wooden workbench near the hull of the Clara Mae. I unlatched the brass clasp and opened the lid. The heavy, familiar scent of cedar and old paper drifted up. Inside, neatly stacked and wrapped in a protective layer of waterproof oilcloth, was a collection of documents. Sitting on top of the stack was a sealed white envelope. Written across the front, in Clara's elegant, sloping cursive, was my name. I picked it up, broke the seal, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. My dearest Thomas, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means two things. It means that my time ran out before I could finish the boat, and it means that our son finally stopped pretending. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my throat. Clara had always been the most perceptive person I knew, but I had never realized how clearly she saw the fractures in our own family. I loved Brandon with all my heart, the letter continued. I spent his entire childhood trying to teach him the difference between what something costs and what something is worth. I prayed he would grow into the kind of man who saw love before price. If you are reading this, he did not. I looked up at the wooden hull of the boat. I remembered Brandon as a teenager standing in the driveway, refusing to get dust on his sneakers, asking his mother why she was wasting time on a piece of junk. 6 months ago, Clara wrote, Monica came into the garage while I was sanding. She didn't offer to help. She just looked at the boat, sighed, and asked me how much I thought it would sell for when I was done. She called it a great investment asset. I saw the way Brandon looked at her when she said it. He didn't defend the work. He didn't defend the history. He just nodded. I realized then that the moment I was gone, they would not see a memory sitting in our garage. They would see a bank account waiting to be cashed. Thomas, I know your heart. I know that if Brandon came to you and demanded to sell the boat, you might eventually let him do it just to keep the peace. You have always been willing to sacrifice your own happiness to avoid fighting with him. But I am not. I will not let my legacy be sold to fund Monica's lifestyle. And I will not let our son break your heart without facing the consequences of his greed. Look underneath this letter. If this boat was sold, read everything before forgiving anyone. I love you, Thomas. Protect the water. Clara, I carefully placed the letter on the workbench. My eyes were burning with unshed tears, a mixture of profound grief and a sudden, rising tide of righteous anger. Clara had spent her final painful months on Earth not just fighting cancer, but quietly building a fortress to protect me from our own son. I unwrapped the oilcloth. Underneath the letter was a thick stack of legal documents. The first document was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was Clara's restoration log. For 25 years, she had documented every single hour she spent on the boat, every sanded plank, every polished screw, every dollar spent on marine varnish. It was a complete, irrefutable accounting of the physical and financial investment she had poured into the hull. The second document was the official state title for the 1961 Chris Craft runabout. I had always assumed the title was just registered in Clara's name, or perhaps jointly in both of ours. But as I looked at the legal owner line, I realized why Clara had spent so much time on the phone with our family attorney during her final weeks. The boat did not belong to Clara, and it certainly did not belong to Brandon. It belonged to the Clara Whitmore Memorial Trust. I pulled out the third document. It was a notarized copy of the trust agreement, drafted and signed just 3 weeks before she died. I scanned the heavy legal text. Clara had established a highly specific, unbreakable trust designed to protect the boat. I was named as the primary beneficiary and sole custodian. I had the right to use, maintain, and possess the boat for the rest of my natural life. Upon my death, the boat was to be donated to the State Maritime Museum, accompanied by a small endowment to fund a marine carpentry scholarship. But it was the forfeiture clause on the third page that made the breath catch in my lungs. Clause 4BB, unauthorized liquidation of trust assets. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. If any heir or family member attempted to sell, transfer, or liquidate the boat without my express, legally verified written consent, the sale was automatically void. More importantly, any heir who engaged in an unauthorized sale would instantly trigger a punitive disinheritance protocol. By attempting to steal the boat, Brandon would automatically forfeit his position as the secondary beneficiary of our primary family estate. He would be legally severed from the larger family trust that contained my life insurance, our property assets, and the retirement accounts Clara and I had built over 40 years. He had sold a boat for $5,000, and in doing so, he had legally detonated a multi-million-dollar inheritance. I looked at the final item in the cedar box. It was a small brass safe deposit key, taped to a business card belonging to Evelyn Shaw, our longtime family attorney. I picked up my cell phone. My hands were no longer shaking. I dialed Evelyn's private number. She answered on the second ring. "Thomas?" Evelyn asked, sounding surprised. "It's Tuesday evening. Is everything all right?" "Evelyn," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Brandon sold the boat." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Evelyn had been Clara's closest friend for 30 years. She had helped draft the trust. She knew exactly what the trap was. "Did he forge a bill of sale?" Evelyn asked, her professional demeanor instantly taking over. I looked at Leonard Briggs. He was standing nearby, watching me with quiet concern. "Leonard," I said, holding the phone away from my mouth.
"Did he give you a bill of sale?"
Leonard nodded. "Yes, sir. Signed with your name. He said you signed it before he brought it to the market." I put the phone back to my ear. "He forged my signature on a fraudulent bill of sale, Evelyn." The silence on the phone was heavy with legal implications. "Thomas," Evelyn said carefully, "you understand what this means, don't you? By forging your signature to sell an asset owned by the trust, he hasn't just triggered the forfeiture clause. He has committed felony fraud." I closed my eyes. The image of Brandon as a little boy sitting in the hollow hull of the boat and pretending it was a spaceship flashed through my mind. It was a memory I had cherished for decades. But Clara's letter had forced me to open my eyes. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who had looked me in the eye, tossed a receipt on my workbench, and told me to get over the desecration of his mother's memory. "I can't send my son to prison, Evelyn," I whispered, the last agonizing remnants of paternal instinct fighting against the cold, hard reality of what he had done. "I know, Thomas," Evelyn replied gently. "And Clara knew that too. That's why she built the trust the way she did. We don't have to involve the police if we handle the asset recovery internally. But the forfeiture clause is absolute. You cannot stop it." I looked at the brass plaque on the cedar box. "Read everything before forgiving anyone, Thomas?" Evelyn asked when I didn't respond. "Are you going to let him get away with this? Are you going to let Monica take that Paris trip using money stolen from Clara's grave?" I felt a sudden, crushing wave of exhaustion. But it wasn't the exhaustion of defeat. It was the exhaustion of a man who has finally stopped running from a painful truth. "I thought about letting it go," I admitted quietly. "I thought about just paying the buyer back out of my own pocket and pretending none of this happened, just to avoid tearing the family apart." Evelyn's voice hardened. "Thomas, mercy is a beautiful thing," she said. "But mercy is not the same as pretending nothing was stolen. Your son did not sell an inheritance. He sold property he never owned. And if you let him do this without consequence, you are telling him that his mother's life was worth exactly $5,000. She was right. Clara had spent 25 years building a legacy. She had spent her final days building a shield to protect me. I could not dishonor her memory by letting her son tear it all down so his wife could take photos in front of the Eiffel Tower. "I'm not letting it go," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "Good," Evelyn said. "Where is the boat now?" "It's safe," I replied, looking at the gleaming mahogany hull resting under the industrial lights of the marina. "It's with a man who understands what it is." I turned to Leonard Briggs. "Mr. Briggs," I said, putting the phone on speaker. "This is my attorney, Evelyn Shaw." Leonard stepped closer. "Yes, ma'am?" "Mr. Briggs," Evelyn said briskly. "The boat you purchased was stolen. The bill of sale you hold is a forgery. The asset belongs to a legally protected trust. I am formally notifying you that the sale is void." Leonard didn't look angry. He didn't demand a refund. He just looked relieved. "I figured as much, ma'am," Leonard said. "I'll keep her safe right here in my shed until you sort out the paperwork." Nobody touches this boat without Mr. Whitmore's permission. Thank you, Leonard, I said. Evelyn, I asked, taking the phone off speaker. What happens now? Brandon and Monica are hosting a farewell dinner tomorrow night at that expensive French restaurant downtown, Evelyn said. They invited half the family to celebrate their anniversary before they fly out on Thursday morning. I knew about the dinner. I had originally planned to stay home, unable to stomach the idea of watching Monica toast to a vacation funded by my wife's empty spot in the garage. I'll draft the asset recovery demand tonight, Evelyn continued. I will bring the trust documents. I want you to bring the cedar box. I looked at the heavy wooden box sitting on the workbench. I thought about the forged bill of sale, the trust clause, and the absolute devastation that was about to rain down on my son. Are we doing this privately? I asked. Evelyn's voice was remarkably cold when she answered. Brandon sold Clara's soul in the middle of a driveway without a second thought, Evelyn said. We are not doing this privately, Thomas. We are going to dinner. The private dining room at l'Orangerie was suffocatingly elegant. It was the kind of restaurant where the menus didn't list prices. The waiters moved like silent ghosts, and the lighting was designed to make everyone look slightly wealthier than they actually were. Brandon and Monica had rented the space to host their Paris farewell dinner. A lavish display of manufactured success meant to impress a dozen of their friends and several members of Monica's extended family. Through the frosted glass doors of the dining room, I could hear the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the shrill, performative sound of Monica's laughter. She was holding court at the head of the long table, dressed in a silk cocktail dress, surrounded by shopping bags and a stack of expensive leather passport covers. We're staying at the George V, Monica was saying loudly, making sure the travel influencer sitting across from her heard every word. Brandon wanted to do something smaller, but I told him, you only celebrate your 5th anniversary once. You can't put a price tag on memories like this. One of her friends, a woman wearing too much perfume, nodded enthusiastically. It's so inspiring, Monica, especially with everything you've been dealing with. The stress of Brandon's family stuff. Monica took a delicate sip of her champagne and sighed, feigning exhaustion. It's been hard, Monica agreed smoothly. Thomas he refuses to move on. He sits in that house surrounded by Clara's old junk. I told Brandon, sometimes you have to stop living in dead people's garages and start living your own life. You have to take what's yours and enjoy it while you still can. I pushed the frosted glass doors open. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I simply walked into the room, holding the heavy cedar box in my hands. The conversation at the table died instantly. Brandon, who was sitting next to Monica, looked up. His face immediately flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. He clearly thought I had shown up to beg him for the boat back in front of his friends. Dad, Brandon said, standing up quickly and pointing toward the door. What are you doing here? Not tonight. We're celebrating. I walked slowly to the head of the table. You sold your mother's 25 years, Brandon, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room. I think I can take 10 minutes. Monica rolled her eyes, placing her champagne glass on the table with a sharp clink. Is this about the boat again? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Thomas, please, don't ruin our evening because you're feeling sentimental. Brandon already explained to you. No, I interrupted, setting the cedar box down on the white linen tablecloth right next to her passport covers. This is about what was inside it. I stepped aside. The heavy wooden doors of the dining room opened again. Evelyn Shaw walked in, carrying a thick leather briefcase. She was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, projecting the absolute, terrifying authority of a senior partner at a corporate law firm. Right behind her was Leonard Briggs, still wearing his canvas work jacket, holding a crumpled piece of paper. And flanking them both was Deputy Mark Harlan, wearing his full county sheriff's uniform, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. The color drained completely from Brandon's face. He looked at the deputy, then at Leonard, and finally at Evelyn. He recognized the attorney immediately. "Evelyn?" Brandon stammered. "What is going on? Why are the police here?" Evelyn didn't answer him. She walked up to the table, unlatched her briefcase, and pulled out a stack of legal documents. "Mr. Briggs," Evelyn said, turning to the marina owner, "can you please confirm what the seller told you when you purchased the wooden hull on Saturday morning?" Leonard looked at Brandon with undisguised disgust. "He told me his father had passed away," Leonard said, his voice rough and loud. "He told me he was clearing out the estate and that the boat belonged to him." Evelyn turned to Deputy Harlan. "Deputy," she said, gesturing to the paper in Leonard's hand. Mark Harlan stepped forward. He took the paper from Leonard and placed it on the table in front of Brandon. It was the bill of sale. "Brandon," the deputy said softly, his tone dangerously calm, "this document transfers ownership of a registered vessel. It requires the legal signature of the registered owner. I've known your father for 20 years. That is not his signature. Did you forge Thomas Whitmore's name on a legal document to facilitate a cash transaction?" Brandon swallowed hard. He looked around the room. His friends were staring at him in stunned silence. Monica's mother looked horrified. It was family property," Brandon stuttered, his arrogant confidence completely shattering. "Dad wasn't using it. It was going to be mine eventually anyway. I expedited it. It's not a crime to sell family property." Evelyn Shaw smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression. "You are correct, Brandon," Evelyn said. "It is not a crime to sell family property. However, it is a felony to sell property that belongs to a legally protected trust." Monica stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "What trust?" she demanded. "What are you talking about?" "It was an old wooden boat in a garage." Evelyn picked up a notarized document from her stack and slid it across the table toward Monica. "That old wooden boat," Evelyn said clinically, "is the sole registered asset of the Clara Whitmore Memorial Trust. Thomas is the sole custodian. You did not sell an inheritance, Brandon. You sold stolen property." Brandon looked at me, panic finally setting into his eyes. "Dad," he pleaded. "Dad, you have to tell them. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. I didn't know about a trust. Mom never said anything." I opened the cedar box. I pulled out the white envelope, took out Clara's letter, and held it up. "Your mother didn't tell you about the trust because she knew exactly who you had become," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She knew that the moment she died, you would look at her life's work and see nothing but a price tag." I looked down at the letter and read her words aloud, letting Clara's voice echo through the silent room one last time. "I prayed he would grow into the kind of man who saw love before price. If you are reading this," he did not. I looked at Monica, who was staring at the letter with wide, terrified eyes. "I will not let my legacy be sold to fund Monica's lifestyle. I continued reading. "And I will not let our son break your heart without facing the consequences of his greed." Evelyn stepped in to deliver the killing blow. "Because the asset belongs to the trust," Evelyn explained, addressing the entire room, "the sale is legally void. The $5,000 you received from Mr. Briggs must be returned immediately." Monica gasped. "You're taking our Paris money," she shrieked, all of her fake elegance vanishing in an instant. "You can't do that. We have non-refundable bookings." "No, Mrs. Whitmore," Evelyn corrected her calmly. "We are recovering proceeds from stolen property. And every non-refundable booking made with those stolen proceeds is now part of the recovery demand." Monica's jaw dropped as she looked at the expensive leather passport covers on the table. The Paris money wasn't just gone. They were going to owe the trust for everything they had already spent. And frankly, Evelyn added, "the Paris money is the least of your concerns." Evelyn turned her devastating focus back to Brandon. "Clara anticipated that you might try something exactly like this, Brandon," Evelyn said. "So she asked me to write a forfeiture clause into the master family estate. Clause 4(b). It stipulates that any heir who attempts an unauthorized liquidation of trust property is immediately and permanently severed from the primary family trust. Brandon stopped breathing. The room seemed to spin around him. "What does that mean?" Monica demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "It means," Evelyn said, packing her documents back into her briefcase, "that by forging a signature to steal $5,000, your husband has legally forfeited his right to inherit his father's house, the life insurance policies, and the family investment portfolios." Brandon collapsed back into his chair. He had sold a boat to buy a vacation, and he had just burned down his entire financial future to do it. "Dad," Brandon begged, tears welling up in his eyes. "Dad, please." "Mom would not want this. She loved me. You can't do this to me." I looked at the son I had loved, the son I had protected, the son who had told me to get over the desecration of his mother's memory just 3 days ago. I looked down at the letter in my hand. I read the final sentence Clara had written to me. "If he tells you I would forgive this." I read, my voice steady and unbroken. "Remember that forgiveness was never meant to be a receipt for theft." Monica slammed her hands on the table. "This is insane," she screamed. "It was an old boat." "No," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "It was the last thing your mother-in-law still touched." I turned away from the table. I picked up the cedar box, holding it carefully against my chest. Deputy Harlan stepped forward and placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Mr. Whitmore," the deputy said, "you and I need to take a ride down to the station to discuss this forged bill of sale. Stand up, please." Evelyn Shaw looked at Monica, who was hyperventilating, staring at the ruined Paris tickets on the table. "The sale did not make Brandon richer," Evelyn said softly, delivering the final, absolute truth of the evening. It triggered the clause Clara wrote for exactly this moment. I walked out of the frosted glass doors, leaving the suffocating elegance of the dining room behind me, and walked out into the cool night air. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The fallout from the Paris farewell dinner was swift, absolute, and completely devoid of mercy. Brandon spent that night in a county holding cell. The reality of his situation crashed down on him the moment the heavy steel door locked behind him. He wasn't a privileged heir anymore. He was a man facing felony fraud charges for forging a legal document. I didn't push for the maximum sentence. Despite everything he had done, the thought of my son spending 5 years in a state penitentiary was more than I could bear. Evelyn negotiated a plea deal with the district attorney. Brandon pleaded guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge of criminal possession of a forged instrument. He avoided prison, but he was placed on strict probation and saddled with a permanent criminal record that would haunt his corporate career forever. As part of the plea, the judge ordered him to complete 200 hours of community service at the State Maritime Museum. Clara had arranged for the boat to end up there one day. Brandon would spend his weekends polishing brass rails for strangers who understood boats better than he ever did. The forfeiture clause, however, was non-negotiable. Evelyn filed the trust enforcement documents the very next morning. Brandon was legally and permanently severed from the Clara Whitmore Memorial Trust and the primary family estate, the house he had grown up in, the investment portfolios Clara and I had built, and the substantial life insurance policies were entirely removed from his reach. He didn't just lose the future he had taken for granted. He lost his marriage. When Monica realized that Brandon had been legally disinherited, that there was no secret safety net, and that the Paris trip was completely dead, the illusion of their perfect life shattered. She didn't stick around to help him rebuild. She filed for divorce 3 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences. She walked away, taking half of what little cash Brandon had left in his personal accounts, leaving him to face the wreckage of his life entirely alone. 4 months passed. I hadn't spoken to Brandon since the night at the restaurant. I spent my days back in the garage, exactly where I belonged. Leonard Briggs hadn't just kept the boat safe. He had offered to help me finish it. 2 evenings a week, Leonard would drive over to my house after he closed the marina. We would stand in the garage, drinking black coffee, working silently side by side. We rebuilt the engine block, installed the new fuel lines, and polished the brass fittings until they gleamed like gold. It was Leonard who finally helped me lower the heavy outboard motor into place and tighten the mounting bolts. One Saturday morning, as I was sweeping up a fresh pile of cedar dust, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I stopped sweeping and leaned the broom against the workbench. Brandon got out of a battered 10-year-old sedan. He looked completely different. The designer athleisure wear was gone, replaced by a cheap, faded flannel shirt and work jeans. He had lost weight, and the arrogant, entitled posture he used to carry had completely collapsed. He looked like a man who had finally been forced to carry the weight of his own actions. He walked slowly up the driveway, stopping a few feet away from the open garage door. He looked at the empty space on the left side of the garage. Then he looked at me. "Dad," Brandon said, his voice quiet and hesitant. I didn't step forward. I just stood there, waiting. "I know I don't have the right to be here," he continued, shoving his hands into his pockets. "But I needed to see you. I needed to apologize." I remained silent. I had spent my entire life bailing him out of trouble, absorbing the impact of his mistakes so he wouldn't have to feel the pain. I wasn't going to do it this time. "I lost everything, Dad," Brandon whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "Monica left me. I had to step down from the firm because of the probation. I'm renting a studio apartment on the other side of town." He looked at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "I didn't know what was inside the boat," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear to you, Dad, if I had known Mom left a letter, if I had known she built a compartment in there, I never would have sold it. I didn't know." I looked at my son. I felt the familiar, heavy ache in my chest, the parental instinct that desperately wanted to pull him into a hug and tell him everything was going to be all right. But I thought about Clara. I thought about the 25 years of sawdust, the chemo treatments, and the fierce, protective love she had poured into that wooden hull. "That was the problem, Brandon," I said, my voice heavy with a grief that I knew would never fully heal. "You didn't know what was inside. You sold it before you cared enough to look." I paused, letting the silence fill the empty space between us. "The box did not make the boat valuable, Brandon," I told him quietly. "The box only proved you never understood that it already was." Brandon closed his eyes, the tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry." I nodded slowly. "I believe you," I said. "But being sorry doesn't change what you did. It just means you finally understand what it cost." I turned around and walked to the workbench. I picked up my coffee mug and took a sip. "I'm not going to hate you, Brandon," I told him, looking over my shoulder. "You're my son, but I can't fix this for you. You have to figure out how to live with the man you chose to become." He stood in the driveway for a long time, the silence stretching between us. Finally, he nodded, turned around, and walked back to his battered car. I watched him drive away, knowing that it would be a long, long time before I saw him again. 2 days later, the sun broke through the clouds over Oak Creek. Leonard Briggs backed his truck down the concrete boat ramp, the heavy tires crunching against the wet gravel. I stood on the wooden dock, holding a thick mooring line wrapped around a polished brass cleat. Slowly, carefully, Leonard eased the trailer into the water. The moment the hull of the Clara Mae touched the surface of the lake, she floated perfectly. The 25 coats of marine varnish caught the afternoon sunlight, glowing with a deep, rich warmth that made the wood look almost alive. Leonard parked the truck and walked down the dock. He untied the safety straps, gave the bow a gentle push, and watched as the boat slid smoothly off the trailer and settled into the water. "She's beautiful, Thomas," Leonard said, taking off his baseball cap and wiping his forehead. "Your wife did an incredible job." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the boat, a lump rising in my throat so large I couldn't swallow. I stepped down into the hull. The wooden floorboards felt solid beneath my boots. I sat down in the captain's chair, resting my hands on the vintage steering wheel. I looked down at the dashboard. Right below the ignition switch, I had mounted the small brass plaque from the cedar box. I reached out and ran my thumb over the engraved letters for Thomas. When the water is calm again, I took a deep breath, inserted the silver key into the ignition, and turned it. The rebuilt engine hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then it roared to life. The deep, throaty rumble of the motor echoed across the water, smooth and powerful, sending a vibration through the wooden hull that felt like a heartbeat. I looked up at the sky, a tear finally escaping and running down my weathered cheek. My son thought he had sold a boat. What he had sold was the last proof that his mother believed love could outlast death. And as I shifted the throttle forward, feeling the hull cut smoothly through the crisp, clear water of the lake, I understood something Clara had known all along. Some things are not valuable because they can be sold. They are valuable because the wrong person cannot understand why they should never be. If you were Thomas, would you have forgiven Brandon because he was your son? Or did selling his mother's 25-year dream for a Paris trip prove he deserved to lose the inheritance Clara protected from him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.